Whoa. Okay, we had Christ the King,
Judges.
and um, that screen so that I can see who's here. Okay. So we had Christ the King Sunday, and we got a little bit of reference from Sandy's sermon that there are many people who are very uncomfortable with the idea that Christ would be considered a king because kings are they rely on hierarchies, they inherit their power, and they often go astray. And but we just don't. The main reason that people are uncomfortable with it is that that a king would probably never have been anything that Jesus would have aspired to. In his washing of feet, he actually tears down hierarchical powers, and he, so to find out all these years that we're celebrating Christ the King Sunday would probably be something that Jesus would question at the least. So, but Israel wanted a king, and they'd had judges. And in many ways, Samuel was the last of the judges. Samuel did the governing basically, and when there was a need for an army, he would call on someone to lead it. So when Sam grew old, his two sons had tried to be judges, but they were not fair. They were corrupt, in fact. They took money and ruled in favor of the people who paid them. So this was not going to bode well for the nation. And so the elders came to Ramah, where our judge Samuel lived, to ask Samuel to dismiss his sons, and he had no qualms with that. His sons didn't deserve power. But more importantly, they asked Samuel to appoint a king. Now, this made Samuel very angry. He prayed, and the Lord advised Samuel to listen to the voices of the people. What made him angry, though, was the fact that this was a way of supplanting God's kingship in the country. And people were then, in a sense, kind of turning their back on all that God had done. And it wasn't that he was going to be replaced, because he was very old. I'm probably sure quite willing to step down, but it was that God would be. So the Lord assured Samuel that the elders had not rejected Samuel, but just his sons, and about that he should not be angry. The Lord, however, went on to say that they had rejected their God, who had always been their true leader and the King of Israel. However, God was willing to let a monarchy evolve. Samuel might not have been if God hadn't been ready. After Samuel had listened to the Lord, he calmed down. And then the Lord instructed Samuel to warn the people about the ways of kings before they committed to that form of government. Samuel said to the elders, "These will be the ways of kings. They will take your sons and force them to become squires, horsemen, charioteers, and commanders on the battlefield." In other words, they will have no choice about, they'll be drafted, would be the way to say it. They will force others of your sons to plow the king's ground and reap their harvests. At the moment, the king doesn't have ground. They will force yet other sons to make equipment for war. They will also take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. And as taxes, they will take the best of your crops from the field, vineyard, and orchard, and give that food to their idle friends hanging around the king's household. And they will take your slaves and donkeys and oxen and have them work on the king's tasks. And the king will take 1/10 of your flocks and your slaves and just keep them. And when you cry out, because of your king whom you have chosen, the Lord will not answer you. So this was going to be quite a change. Not only that, but land would be granted to the king that then those sons could plow. So Samuel then let the elders talk this over while he withdrew to pray. And they decided in favor of a king. The Lord told Samuel to set a king over them. The elders went home to let Samuel and God manage this change. And the interesting thing is that God said, you may have a king, but I get to choose who it is. And that probably wasn't what the elders had in mind. They probably wanted to select someone who would favor them, do things that were economically favorable to them and so forth. So they didn't quite get all they thought they would. So throughout the book of Samuel, there is a conflict between the monarch's authority and religious authority. Samuel is ambivalent to the monarchy and will often make pronouncements that undermine it. And you'll see this in the crowning or in the anointing of Saul when he does it in public. But there's a theological conflict going on. People say they want to be like the nations that surround them. That was the only reason they actually gave for having a king to Samuel. They want to be like the others. Sounds very middle school. But they have, the other nations had kings who could act in ways more comprehensible than God's actions. Are they balking at the ephemeral nature of letting God keep control? Do they want to transfer God's power into human hands where it will feel like people have control? Samuel thinks so. And I can't read. And as reported, what does it say after that?
In the book, so does God.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So God is saying, yeah, this is what they're really asking for. They'd like to step down from trusting me and put this in human control. I think we're so used to human control that we would find it odd to step back and let God control. I think we're very used to trying to figure everything out almost without asking God, especially in political power. What would happen if someone said to Trump or even Joe Biden, you know, what you need to do is just go pray for 40 days and come back and tell us what needs to be done.
Well, Joe Biden does go to church, and I think he does pray every day.
I think he does.
I mean, I think that's one of the great changes is that he is a man of faith.
Yeah,
And I
truly.
think we will go to God to seek help with things. I just, um, I agree with it, and I think that it's impressed me, Mother Mary, and I use the Book of Prayer as I go through each week in the whatever it is, and I do the readings in the Old Testament. And being raised Presbyterian, the Old Testament was very important, so I knew a lot about it. But the people always would turn on God for their own wealth, their own what they thought were well-being. And son of a gun, something bad happened. And they always think they know what they want, and they sort of get it for a while, and then they have to deal with the aftermath.
Right.
And boy, that's just the way life is. We just think we know where we're going, but we don't seek help. We don't seek guidance. And son of a gun, we make terrible mistakes. And I think this is a really good example of, all right, we've moved God further away from us now. We've got this king in between us and God. And the development of the divine right of kings thinking, and good old James I, who was raised Presbyterian in Scotland, sure liked the divine right of kings when he got to England. And I thought, it's so interesting how that power corrupts. Absolutely.
I
Yes.
ask a question. Well, I'm thinking of the Pope.
Yes.
Supposed to be have God's ear.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I'm thinking of Islamic State. That's supposed to be, the religious are supposed to rule. So how do you know that the person who's supposed to be listening to God and the judge, they go bad, just like Samuel's son?
Yep.
So
Samuel's sons. Samuel has been pretty pure, but his sons were not going to take over, and neither was Eli's sons. They were not going to work either.
Yeah.
And part of the hereditary power is that you're stuck with whoever comes up in the next generation.
That's right.
And that you will see, well, if you will see some of it, but it wasn't you'd think it would just go to the first son. All the way through the Bible, though, it doesn't. And even in the successor to David,
Yeah,
wasn't the firstborn son at all, or even the oldest. And so you have some choice, but the power that they have even corrupts David, who does have faith and does return to God after sinning, but still, you're right. I mean, you don't have. When they choose a pope, I think they try to get somebody who, who will be compliant to God's will, I guess, who will check it. But all of us can really mess up when we think we're sure, even when we've been faithful.
Well, I was just wondering, what is the difference between the king, asking for a king, and continuing with judges? Because when you bring a human being in place, there's no guarantee either way.
Yes. One of the things about the kingship that would be different from what they're used to right now is that the judge would not have a standing army to enforce the king as the king will all the time, to enforce the king's will. They would just create the army as needed whenever some invasion occurred among the tribes on any tribal border from outside. Then the rest of the tribes would put an army together and go and deal with it. So not having total control of the army would give that judge less power, much less power, and the result was that the workers, the tribal authorities, had a lot to say about everything else that was done in the state, and now that's not going to be the case. Let's look at this political thing. Do I have political up? Yeah. Okay, the political conflict. Kings will centralize the government around a capital city. Tribes and their rulers will have to subordinate and to a large extent conform to that rule, and their individual tribes will no longer be able to sort of carry on in the way that they're used to. There will be resistance to this. Is the reporting of Samuel's complaints about the king merely and I can't read the last sentence, so you'll need to read it.
A reflection of the resistance in his time.
Yeah. Because even though the elders asked, it may not have been a representative from every tribe, or maybe the true leaders of every tribe. They gathered unasked and asked for this king. But you know that when you change a form of government, there will be resistance, and we certainly are living through that resistance right now.
Yep.
So all the way through, you get Samuel pointing out that tribal stuff is still important, and when you get to David, there's a place where David chooses to move the ark, and that's God's business and the tribe's business, and God stops him because that isn't for him to do. So that is just another place where this resistance occurs. Now, the real reason for a king is not mentioned in this chapter, but it is truly most important. A king will have a standing army ready to make immediate responses to incursions from the Philistines and others. The volunteer soldiers sent to augment, that would be all the tribal folks that would come to be with that standing army in a time of war, will have professional commanders who will know the plan and therefore make use of the volunteers to implement the strategies. And then you'll have to read the next. I thought I had this thing. Oh, there it is. Oddly, the military reasons for having a king are not mentioned in these chapters. But that's really what's going on. To what extent is this conflict an echo of Samuel's time? And to what extent is it an echo of the skepticism about monarchs by the editors who were in exile in Babylon? For those editors, the monarchy utterly failed. So you've got these two layers going on in this story, at least two, and there may be a third, which would be the editors in Josiah's time. And you can't.
You just taught me something, Mother Mary. I didn't know that Samuel was written down when the Jewish leaders were in Babylon, because they didn't take everybody to Babylon.
No.
And it was people that had power and could do things that they wanted them to do. And that does make a difference because they were slaves in Babylon.
Not badly. They
Okay.
actually, they earned money. They had houses. They even had banks that were Jewish banks. So it wasn't quite like, enslavement. It was just that you weren't allowed to go
Inside.
home. You were
Rita,
welcome
inside.
to drive if you wanted to while you were there. And they did. They just couldn't worship in the temple because, there was no Jerusalem and there was no home, but they were doing okay. All right, let's see. God tells Samuel not to make their preference for not to take their preference for a king personally. The rejection is God, not Samuel, that is embedded in the request for kings. The request is in essence sinful in that it goes against God's will. However, God is gracious and allows this change to occur. God does not abandon the people whom God saved from slavery in Egypt and who has been trying to break with God ever since. However, God does reserve the right to, and would you read the rest?
Appoint
God.
their king.
Go ahead.
Appoint their king.
Yes. Yeah. So that's the situation. All right.
Yes.
Okay. God chooses a king and from an unlikely source. And this is a folktale, just kind of put in the midst of this semi-historical text and definitely theological text. This is just a delightful kind of story. This is one of 3 stories that eventually they have to make Saul king. And all 3 seem to be making him king at that point. And then you get the next story and he's apparently not recognized as king. Or you get the next story and it's finally confirmed by everybody. Or, so it's like there were 3 stories and the editor is just trying to get them all in some way. So I'm trying to read this from slides on my phone and the phone keeps blinking out. Okay. A man named Kish from the smallest tribe, which is Benjamin, had a son named Saul. And if you look on the map, right about in the center is this little tiny blue spot. And that is the tribal land given to Benjamin. So it is a very insignificant tribe. Judah had such land and people that they always had the better soldiers and the bigger armies to send to whatever need was needed. Benjamin just simply couldn't. Okay.
Yeah.
Zebulun
Go ahead.
was a tiny little place also.
Yes, it didn't last all that long. It kept getting eaten up by other countries. Saul was handsome and about a foot taller than most other men. Some donkeys belonging to Kish strayed, and Kish sent Saul and a serving boy to go find them. The 2 passed through Ephraim, following the trail of the donkeys, but they never caught up to them. The boy then said, "There's a man of God, a seer in this town. Let us go and ask him about the donkeys." And Saul said, "Well, that's a good idea, but we need some bread to donate to him, and we're out." And then the boy found a 1/4 shekel of silver in his pocket and offered that. Saul then said, "Thanks, let's go to the seer." Saul referred to Samuel as seer throughout this portion, which makes scholars think that this was originally a separate story incorporated into the book of Samuel. Next, they came up to some girls from town who pointed out the road for them to follow out to a farm where Samuel was blessing a sacrifice and where he intended to stay for a feast. As they entered that road, which took them through the city, they saw Samuel coming toward them, but they did not know it was Samuel, the man they sought. Samuel, on the other hand, had been told by God that day before the man, the day before, that a man would show up that day who was from the tribe of Benjamin. God instructed Samuel to anoint this Benjamite to be the first king of Israel so that he could save Israel from the Philistines. And therefore, when Samuel saw Saul, God told Samuel that this was the one to anoint. Saul, completely unaware of Samuel's conversation with God, asked the old man where he might find the seer. "I am the seer," said Samuel. "Today, go with me to the sacrifice, eat with me, and go home in the morning." Saul, a stranger to Samuel, thought Samuel was being a little too friendly. But then Samuel went on to say, what? Okay. As your donkeys were lost 3 days, they have been found, so don't worry about them. As Saul was telling himself that he'd never mentioned the donkeys and that this was amazing that Samuel knew about them, Samuel went on to say, "All Israel's desire is fixed on you."
No pressure, though.
Well, I don't think he's figured out that that's about being a king yet. Saul responded, "I am only a Benjamite and my family is humble. Why did you say that?" Samuel never replied to that. He just signaled for Saul to follow him. At the feast that night, Samuel put Saul at the head of the table above 30 invited guests. And Samuel gave Saul the best cuts of meat and the finest food. And Saul is still, I think, trying to figure this out. It doesn't say that Saul has a clue. When dinner was over, Samuel ordered that a bed for Saul be made up on the roof where the evening desert breeze would be cool. And Samuel awoke Saul at dawn and walked with him to the edge of town. And there Samuel stopped and announced that he had something important to say, the word of God. Now, we don't know what he said, though. And Samuel took a horn of oil and poured oil from it on Saul's head. And Samuel said, the Lord has anointed you ruler over Israel. So that is the word of God. You shall reign over the people and the Lord of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of the enemy all around this nation. Now Saul was deeply skeptical, and Samuel could see that in Saul's face. So you have kind of a traditional call thing going on here. You have somebody pronouncing that you are the one. You have a deep sense, the person who receives this, and this would sort of a pattern is for Moses too and all others, would be this sense that you are not worthy and that there's been a mistake. And then you're given signs for, for Moses, it was this voice coming out of the bush, which would be a pretty big sign. But for Samuel, the sign is that the seer is going to tell him everything that will happen on his way home. So now Saul was deeply skeptical, and Samuel could see that in Saul's face. Samuel said, "Will you believe me if I tell you everything that will happen on your journey home today?" And then I'm missing a line again.
Saul nodded.
Okay. When you pass through Bethlehem and stop by Rachel's tomb to rest, two men will tell you, the donkeys you see are back at home, and now your father is worried about where you are. Samuel continued, when you get to the Oak of Tabor, three men heading to Bethel will greet you. One will be carrying a young goat, another will carry bread, and a third will carry a wineskin. These men will give you 2 loaves of bread. And when you come to the place where the Philistine fort is, you'll meet a band of prophets in a frenzy of dancing. And that's when the Spirit of the Lord will possess you, and you will be in a frenzy with them and be turned into a different person. Samuel then advised, when you meet these prophets, do whatever seems right to you, for God is with you. Saul left Samuel with a wondering heart. All the signs about which Samuel spoke happened just as Samuel predicted. And when Saul finally did get home, his uncle asked him where he had been. And Saul explained that he had run into the seer named Samuel, and Samuel insisted that he stay overnight. Saul said absolutely nothing about being anointed Israel's first king. So that's kind of the folk story of how Saul was chosen. Clearly, he still needs an introduction to the nation if he's going to be king. And that's what the next story tells. So this is a 3-stage process. And we may not get to the 3rd stage. I'm not sure how the time will work out, but that's what happened. Any feelings about this story? Any ideas about Saul or what God's doing?
It reminds me of Joseph Campbell's laying out of the reluctant warrior. And, a modern version of that, of course, is Luke Skywalker. So you always have the young man who's reluctant and doesn't think he's worthy of the title. And it just adds more credence to it because it's sort of an honest journey, that only perhaps Saul could do this because he was reluctant, because he was humble in that regard. I don't know.
Yes.
Good point. Good
Mhm.
thinking.
What are you thinking, Mike?
Well, I'm curious as to how he would handle the Council of Israel with all the political things that go on with tribes. Because the Jewish people are very stiff-necked people. So I bet you the first 2 years of his rule was a learning experience.
For all of them, yeah. Okay, so we need to make him publicly the king, and that's what we'll do next. Let's see. If I can get this thing.
Always like the story.
Screen sharing has stopped.
Well, good job, Mother Mary. Thanks for giving us stuff we need to have remind us or learn. So I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, here we're what time is it? We've got time, I guess.
It's 10:53.
Yeah, I have to leave in about 5 minutes. Just know I'm not mad. I'm just leaving. I've got to teach Sunday school.
Oh, God bless you. All righty. So, let's see. All righty.
May I ask Elaine a question?
Yes.
Elaine, I have bags of felt from the Christmas stockings I made for Covenant Cupboard. Could you use them at Sunday school at all?
Well, not right now, but eventually.
Well, I will save them.
We're
then.
doing it over Zoom, but yeah,
I know,
I'm sure.
but I will save it then because they're red and green.
Perfect.
But you know, there's a lot of pieces there that I'd rather not have to just throw away.
Sure.
So I will keep
Tuck
them.
them somewhere, and in a year when we're back, and
I will keep them for you.
okay.
All righty.
So Saul is publicly made king, and Saul engages Israel's enemies in this process. But Samuel summons the people to assemble at Mitzvah, and he told them these words from the Lord. And you see where mitzvah means justice. It's also the place where the last time he assembled people, they were attacked by the Philistines, and with God's help, they did a pretty good job of chasing them away. But God was the warrior. Now they're going to ask a man to take that role and keep them safe. So Samuel may, just by choosing Mitzvah as the place to meet, may be objecting in his own way to this whole idea of kingship. I brought you out of Egypt to Israel and rescued you from the kingdom that oppressed you. Today you rejected your God, who can save you from all your distresses, and you have asked that a king be set over you instead. Therefore, send representatives forward by tribe. And they put lots, that is, they put their rock with their name on it in a big bowl, and then someone pulled out a rock. And therefore, and the tribe of Benjamin was chosen by Lot. Okay. Now, I told you he always said things that made it very hard for the king to keep ruling, and that was one of them. No matter who they chose, people were going to be doubtful about giving trust to this person. So it wasn't very helpful at all. Now, select a family from the tribe of Benjamin by Lot, and the Matri family was chosen. Now select a member of that family, and Lot was chosen by Lot. Or see, Saul was chosen by Lot. And when Samuel and the people called for Saul to step forward, he was not there. So it's the Lord that finds him. And then the Lord told Samuel that Saul had hidden among the baggage. That would be all the tent makings, whatever, that had come off the camels. So Samuel sent some men to drag him out of hiding and to come before the assembly. So if you thought your king was too scared to take on the role, that would not give you a lot of confidence. But it also might speak to his humility. So,
Well, it almost
Please.
seems like the people didn't want, they wanted the freedom. They didn't want the responsibility that went with it.
yeah.
They wanted someone else to take the responsibility and the blame if anything went wrong. But they wanted all the freedom to do what they wanted to do without.
It was not a good role to step into. You're right. Many of us have interviewed, and part of our job in an interview is to try to figure out just how life would be
Yeah.
under this boss, you
Yeah.
know. And when he stood next to Samuel, he stood head and shoulder taller than everyone else. And Samuel said, "Do you see? There's no other like him." So now Samuel's trying to be supportive. And the people shouted, "Long live the king." Samuel then wrote the laws about the kings, listing their rights and responsibilities. The people and Saul agreed to these rules, and they presented this to the Lord, vowing before God to follow these laws. Now, the idea that some laws were written is kind of strikes a chord, because Deuteronomy was found in this time of Josiah, which would be after the kingdom had split, and Israel, the northern kingdom, had been lost to the Assyrians. And so there was just Judah left, basically. And at that point, they find this law in the remodeling of and refurbishing of the temple. And what's very curious about that law is that they didn't know it existed. Well, scholars wonder if it had existed before that, and if the Deuteronomists didn't write it then, because this is the book of Deuteronomy, the second law book, and in it are the rights of kings. So if you're editing Samuel after you have Deuteronomy and you are a Deuteronomist, chances are you will want to legitimize that law by having it appear way back in history. And that's maybe what's going on here. Follow that? Did that?
Yes.
Saul gathered those who wanted to be full-time warriors and took them to Gibeah to create Israel's first standing army. Actually, he gathered people who felt that the Spirit of the Lord had asked them to be soldiers. So some worthless fellows despised their king and said, "How can this man save us?" These showed they did not respect Saul's authority by not bowing to him, and nor did they promise to follow the laws regarding kings, nor did they bring him any gift, which was a way of submitting to your king. And they're called worthless ones, which becomes kind of a signal because they show up later. Saul did not punish those people. He seemed to know that they needed time to see what the king could do. So, how's our time? I can't tell. We have a few minutes.
Keep going. Keep
Pardon?
going, Mary. Keep going, Mary.
All right. So Saul saves the tribes of Gad and Reuben. They're the tribes that live closest to the Dead Sea and just above that, on the east side of the river. Okay. Along the northeast border of Israel across the Jordan was a land given to the tribes of Gad and Reuben. And the Ammonites were waging war. They were the people just outside those tribal lands and were trying to push in and take the land. Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was winning. And it seemed that God had not raised up anyone to deliver, that is, save the Israelites. And because King Nahash wanted to empty the land of all Israelites so that he could move his people into it, he had a rule that no Israelite could surrender unless they allowed the Ammonite soldiers to put out their right eye. Lots of Israelites had lost eyes to the Ammonite warriors. Now 7,000 warriors had fled from the battle and had hid inside the walls of Jabesh Gilead, which is outside, almost outside of their territory. On this map, you see up here at the top, you see Gad, and then you see Jabesh Gilead listed. But Ammonites are way out of their, way deep into other territory there when they go chase those 7,000. Now the 7,000 may have been the word that translates thousands, may be contingent, in which case we really don't know how many people actually were inside the walls of Jabesh. The king Nahash and the Ammonites followed them and besieged that city, announcing that the city could surrender only when every man in town would submit to having their right eye slashed open. The elders said, "Give us 7 days." Meanwhile, the Israelite messengers asked the rest of the tribes for help. The messenger from Jabesh Gilead came to Gibeah, where Saul's warriors were camped. The people who heard the message started to cry, out of sympathy, I think. Now Saul had been plowing a field with oxen, and when he came into the town, he was distressed to see this sadness. And then he found out, when he found out why, they were all, then he found out why they were all weeping. And the Spirit of the Lord came on Saul and empowered him. And Saul became very angry. But that's with God's help, he's getting angry, which is kind of interesting. He killed the oxen with which he had been plowing his field, and sent a piece of his oxen to every tribe in Israel with this message: if you don't come to fight, this is what our enemies will do to you. Meet me in Bezek. Can you find Bezek on the map? It's kind of it's in black, but across from Jabesh. $300,000, this could be 300 contingents, came. And the tribe of Judah sent 7,000 of them. And Saul sent a messenger to Jabesh Gilead, saying, "By noon tomorrow, you will be delivered," or saved. So then the people of Jabesh said to the enemy king Nahash of the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender, and you may do what you want with us." The people of the city lied, so the Ammonites would be less vigilant and maybe unprepared for battle. The next day, Saul divided his army into 3 groups so they could attack from 3 sides. Saul attacked at dawn, and the Ammonites who were still alive by noon had scattered. The Bible says no 2 were left together, and this means that the Ammonite army could not reassemble for a counterattack. Saul's warriors then said, "Let us now attack the Israelite towns that did not send soldiers to this battle to punish them for disrespecting our new king." And this is where Saul redeems himself. He may not be able to say this later in his rule, but he says it now. "The Lord delivered Israel today, not me," replied Saul. "No one who stays home will be punished." So he clearly knows who's in charge, and he's, which is great. I mean, that's what you want from a king, or what God would want anyway. The volunteer soldiers first, and the full-time warriors marched with Saul to Gilgal, where they rendezvoused with Samuel. And there was a ritual led by Samuel, and the people renewed, that's the word used, Saul's kingship and celebrated a feast. What is interesting is that in the first story, he becomes a Nagid, which is the leader. In the second story, he's referred to as Nagid, even though he's been anointed and chosen by Lot. In the third story, they finally use the word anointed one, which is Messiah. So it's like it takes all of this to finally get him firmly planted in the kingship that was given him. Okay, so that's how Saul did it. And God did it. What do you think?
Good story.
How many of you knew these parts of the story before?
No.
No.
So Saul does stray from God's favor and Samuel's favor, but at this point, all seems to be right with the world.
Yay.
Mary,
Yes.
I really enjoyed your stories today. I think it was excellent and well prepared. And I loved the different kinds of artwork depicting the story as opposed to the same artwork all the way through. I love the variety. It was great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're most welcome. Well, have a nice week. And we'll pick up 101 whenever, probably not until after Epiphany, because they've got other stuff for adults to do. And he asked me if I wanted to run this simultaneously to his adult ed stuff. And I thought, you know, what I see are the same people. And now we would just conflict them as to whether they would want to do this or that. And frankly, I'd rather be taught by Gary. So.
I like both programs, so I'm glad that you said that. You know, if it was running parallel, we couldn't do that.
Yeah, I said, I think we need to ask, you know, before we consider separating, or if the class becomes larger and larger and that makes more sense, then we can do it. But it doesn't seem right yet.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thank
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's wonderful.